Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so very much for coming. My name is Arthur Millick. I'm the executive director of the Claremont Institute Center for the American Way of Life here in Washington, D.C. The right has gone through, let's say, three phases over the past 10 years. First, it was laughter at the left. Laughing, thinking that this or that policy, this or that outrage can be solved just with laughter. That steadily turned into a kind of hopelessness when one saw how pervasive everything was that we were laughing at. And the hopelessness led to a kind of dejection that has only been rehabilitated. And I think that that's what everybody in this room shares, which is a renewed seriousness that I haven't seen in my lifetime about engaging in politics in a way that isn't just about marketing and advertising, but is about owning institutions. The book that we're partly here to discuss, to celebrate, is a book that was put together by a lot of writers, some of whom are in this audience, that maps out the right's errors over the last generation, point by point, issue by issue. The right is not good in many ways at doing autopsies on itself, looking at itself in the mirror and looking at its own losses. If a corporation doesn't learn from its mistakes, it goes out of business. If a doctor doesn't learn from his mistakes and his patients get hurt, he loses his license and goes out of business. Take that analogy to every single profession. It applies everywhere, except for the establishment right. Nobody is ever punished. Only the country suffers on account of it. On immigration, on universities, on the administrative state, on various funding programs that fund the right's enemies directly. Nothing ever seems to change, no matter how hard you vote. And in a moment when the left possesses nearly all of the major institutional powers in the country, much of the right pretends like it's still business as usual. It's not. Sometimes a country or a party can lose and never recover itself once and for all. And we always forget that. But things, it feels, are changing in the air. You feel it. And it's thanks to some of the people in this room. A lot of people in DC, when you confront them with the bad situation in the country, with the almost total institutional control of the left, say, well, you still have to hope. Fair enough. It's bad to be without hope and simply be pessimistic. But it's also a vice. It can be a vice in that it implies that something, somewhere, will rescue you eventually. And that may not be true. You may be the ones, or your representatives, serious political people may be the ones that rescue you from the situation. I would like to quickly introduce one of our special guests here, Senator TThe Vance. Unlike a lot of Republicans, he doesn't forget where he came from and who he's here for. May Yale one day revoke his degree because he's been so effective. He is the most intelligent and thoughtful U.S. senator and the only one set on actually restraining the power of the left nationally. Please welcome Senator TThe Vance.
Thanks, Arthur, and good to see everybody. I was told, because we're in the Capitol's Visitor Center, that I cannot encourage anyone to purchase this book. I can only say that it's very well done, and it has great seeds of wisdom. Purchase it if you would like to, but don't purchase it if you would not like to. But congratulations on such a great book, and thanks for getting such a good crew together. Obviously, many of you are my friends, people who I've listened to and debated with for many years as we try to figure out how to save the country. You know, I thought what I could do here that would be most useful is actually offer some practical insights into what I've actually seen being in government nearly a year now. We talk a lot about how to fix Washington, D.C. I've been doing the very practical work for the past year of trying to figure out what that actually means and how to put it into practice. And so I thought that I'd offer just a few observations here. And then I know we are running a little short on time, but if you guys want to ask me a few questions afterwards, I'll try to be relatively brief here. Wells, who's my great staffer and has prepared these incredible remarks, is going to be disappointed in me because I never actually look at my remarks as they're prepared. I just kind of say whatever I think. And so that hasn't got me into too much trouble yet. I guess it's got me here, so maybe it has gotten me into a fair amount of trouble. But here goes. So three broad insights I'd like to leave you with as I have been a U.S. Senator for all of a year now, not even quite a year. The first is that I think that those of us, you call it it's called the new right. And I think it's called the new right because those of us in the conservative movement are trying to do something new with the old institutions, something new with the old ideas, and something new with the old tradition of American conservative failure. And I hate to say it, but that is the defining inheritance of American conservatism for the past 30 years. It has been that we have largely failed at the goals that we have set out to accomplish. I, like a lot of American conservatives, pay a great amount of attention to what goes across the pond in the United Kingdom. And I try to ask myself, Margaret Thatcher was a very successful prime minister electorally, but is there a single thing that Margaret Thatcher actually fought for that has proven successful in 2023 Britain? Or if you go back to the Reagan Revolution in the 1980s and asked, what is it that you want, if you ask the voters, what is it that you want out of this presidency? Did any of it actually succeed? Maybe the enduring legacy of Ronald Reagan's tenure in Washington was the 1986 immigration reform, which set about the greatest change in American immigration policy in a generation. And the consequences of it we're still feeling today. The consequences of it, by the way, have turned multiple red states blue, and I think have transformed our country in very profound ways. That's not a criticism of Ronald Reagan, who I think was genuinely a great president. It's a criticism of the approach of the conservative movement, which I think has been structurally flawed for a very long time. How is it that we keep on winning elections and keep on losing the country's most important battles? That's something that we have to be honest with ourselves and not just sort of point to the past and say, these are great people. Many of them were great people, but many of them failed despite being great people. And I think if we want to succeed where they failed, it will require us to think about those failures in new ways. The first thing that I've learned, having been a senator for all of a year, is that we need to remember who we serve. We get way too abstract. I think all of us here are mostly pretty smart people. We care a lot about ideas. We read things like The American Mind or Up From Conservatism, and we think and care a lot about the life of the mind. But most of the people that we represent and most of the people that we serve, they're human beings. They're worried about really important things like raising their children or figuring out how to pay the mortgage, which, quite frankly, thanks to the Biden administration's policies, has gotten a lot harder in the last few months. What the people that we're serving are very, very different, even from the think tank intellectuals that we sort of think of as aligned here in Washington, D.C. In fact, they're very different from the think tank intellectuals that we think of as aligned here in Washington, D.C. So I think a lot of us, a lot of people who work in this town, their instinct is to sort of view them as this distant group of people. And yet it is the American Constitution that gives those people the power to decide what our government ultimately looks like. We've got to know who we're actually represented. They're not conservatives primarily of the mind because, like I said, they've got more important things going on, but they are conservatives of the heart. They love the country. They love the community that they came from. They don't see this place as some distant, abstract set of ideas. They see it as the place where their grandfathers or their great-grandfathers set down roots, where they built a business, where they've tried to build community. That doesn't make them, in my view, unsophisticated. What it does is it makes them actually wise because they realize that this country is not primarily about the ideas that bounce around the minds of intellectuals and of senators and of congresspeople. They realize that this country is about the lived experiences, to borrow a term from the left, of the people who actually occupy it. We shouldn't be afraid of that word, by the way. The lived experiences of the people that we represent are, I think, where the greatest source of strength in our movement actually comes from. When I was first elected, it's sort of a crazy thing that happened. I was very much in new senator mode. I was still figuring out where the hell all the doors were, right? You had no idea where to go around it. My credit to Jamal Bowman for showing us all where one of the most important exits were in these buildings. But I still, all kidding aside, had no idea how to get around this building. And yet we had this terrible train crash in East Palestine, Ohio. And you all saw the mushroom cloud, the chemicals burning and so forth. And there were two sort of very quick insights that I gleaned from spending so much time in East Palestine. The first is that this is a town that the train crash was really bad, but East Palestine had been left behind by this country for 40 or 50 years. It had suffered terribly from waves of deindustrialization. There were people there who were trying to figure out how to piece back together their community, how to create wealth and create jobs and opportunity in East Palestine, Ohio. This train crash was just another in a long line of leadership that kicked these people in the teeth. It was bad, and I don't mean to understate it, but it was a it came as part of a long line of really bad things that had happened in East Palestine, Ohio. If you had visited it the day before the train crash, you would have said, this is a community that has been left behind by policymakers in Washington, D.C. Indeed, it had been left behind by policymakers in Washington, D.C. Now, the second thing I learned is that after the train crash, it's quite shocking how much public policy in this town is driven by lobbyists. I mean, we talk about this all the time. But in reality, when you try to do something to help the people of East Palestine, Ohio, there are 10 layers of lobbyists, 10 layers of bureaucracy, and then 10 layers of idiots on top of that. So 30 layers that you have to deal with before you can actually get the people of East Palestine any help. I actually heard from Republican congressmen, Republican senators, and by the way, remember that most of the rail lines in our country go through less densely populated areas, the very types of areas that we represent here in the Republican Party. And I heard repeatedly that if we did anything to try to call the railroads to account, if we tried to do anything to make it less likely that trains would crash and set off chemical bombs in our communities, that we were somehow violating sacred tenets of conservatism. Well, I think the sacred tenet of conservatism is to remember who we serve and to defend the people who actually make our communities what they are, not to defend railroad companies, by the way, many of whom were donating hundreds of thousands of dollars to Democrats in the run-up to the election of 2022, many of whom have actively leaned into the most left-wing take on the culture wars over the last 2 decades. Is it really our job to defend the railroads and not the people who had a chemical explosion set off in their community? If that's your attitude about what's going on in this country, then I think that you've got a very screwed up notion of American conservatism. Remember who we serve. We are elected to do a job. Of course, most importantly, to uphold the Constitution of this country, and after that, to do something meaningful for the people who elected us. Don't forget that, and don't forget the people who actually gave us that power in the first place. Now on that, the second insight I want to leave you with is Republicans, conservatives, we're still terrified of wielding power, of actually doing the job that the people sent us here to do. You heard Arthur say this earlier, that so many of the institutions have been captured by the left. How many of us have been worried about this problem? That the media, the financial institutions, some of our biggest corporations, the technology sector, and the censorship that comes along with it, and of course, the universities and the institutions of education have been captured by the left, some of them for generations in this country. And yet, the one thing that our voters can actually get, the one institution that our voters can actually win in this country is when they go and vote and elect Republicans. And then when they elect Republicans, what do all of us say? We all say we don't think the government should do anything. How is that anything other than a lose-lose proposition for the people who sent us? If on the one hand, you have nearly every major and powerful cultural and financial institution in this country aligned with the left, and on the other hand, you occasionally have the people's democratic government that answers to the right, why shouldn't we be doing something with the people's elected government when they give us the opportunity to do so? Right? Isn't it just common sense that when we're given power, we should actually do something with it? I hear this all the time in critiques of the administrative state that come from the American conservative movement. And a lot of the critiques, of course, I agree with. The administrative state is too big. It does do too much. It is really hard. I mean, I was an investor and a business guy before I got into politics. Try to build something in this country and run into the layers of NEPA certifications and environmental regulations that have nothing to do with protecting the environment, but they have a lot to do with employing bureaucrats. Our critiques of the administrative state are very often correct, but our answer to this can't be every single time the American people give us power, the only thing that we try to do is to trim down the thing that they gave us control over. Sometimes we ought to say, instead of just trimming this thing down, why don't we actually make it more responsive to the will of the people? In my view, the most egregious and out of control part of the deep state in this country is the Department of Justice. The leadership of the Department of Justice is actively prosecuting its political opponents. I'm not just talking about Donald Trump, of course. We know that Douglas Mackey is almost at the brink of serving prison time. I understand that a federal court stepped in and prevented him from going to prison. Why? For posting a meme, for posting a joke. Merrick Garland is trying to throw this guy in prison for close to a year because he posted a joke on the internet. And yet, our response to this is, as far as I can tell, that we should have the Department of Justice doing less. Well, I agree it should be doing less, but maybe it should actually do something good too. Maybe we should actually be appointing attorneys at the Department of Justice who investigate the corruption in our own government. Maybe we should be appointing people at the Department of Justice who actually take a side in the culture war, the side of the people who elected us, and not just pretend we don't have to take sides at all. This is crazy to me. Every single time the American people give us an opportunity, we tell them we don't deserve the opportunity. We just want to make this thing smaller. We should be much more focused on making it responsive to the will of the people. I know there are a lot of articles in this book about that very topic, but we've got to get comfortable with wielding power. That's something our voters expect of us. I remember a conversation I was having with a guy after a campaign rally. It was more of a town hall. In the early days of my Republican primary campaign, this was probably summer of 2021. And I gave this sort of thunderous speech against big tech. And I argued, we've got to stop the technology oligarchs from censoring American conservatives. We've got to be willing to break these companies up. Use the Teddy Roosevelt option. They're too big, they're too powerful, and if they're preventing conservatives from participating meaningfully in the public debate, we've got to be willing to use power to stop them, to stop that power and to push back in the other direction. And I remember this guy came up in his very nice suit afterwards. He came up in his nice suit, and it was clear that he was a guy of high credentials and good education, probably had a very nice job. And he said, I really agreed with everything that you said, but I had to push back with what you said about the technology companies. I was like, oh no, here we go. This is a David French critique, that these are private companies, right? We can't do anything to the technology companies because they are private companies. We should let the market decide what is censored and what is part of our public debate. And he said, look, why do you want to break these companies up? Why don't we just throw all their CEOs in prison? My point is that our voters are much, much more willing to invest us with the ability to do something. And frankly, a lot of them are willing to go much further than even I'm willing to go. And I'm probably willing to go much further than pretty much anybody else in this building. My point is, the voters, when they give us power, we have to be willing to wield it. This is not a high-class debating society. This is the United States Congress, and it ought to actually respond to the people who give it all of its authority. The third point that I want to make here is we have to be less ideological. What do I mean by that? Again, I sort of point this out. Many of us are conservatives of the mind. We read things like Hayek and Arthur Millet and all these other geniuses that are in this volume. We think a lot about how to apply principles from 250 years ago to the problems of 2023. But in the experience that I've had as a U.S. Senator, so much of what's going on in our movement is a pure question of who is going to help us accomplish our goals and who is trying to hurt us to accomplish our goals. And if somebody's going to help us accomplish our goals, we ought to be willing to make common cause with them and go and get something done. You just highlight this in a couple of ways. So what are the dumbest debates that's going on in the new right? I mean, the people that I consider my closest friends in the American conservative movement is whether we should be pro or anti-union, okay? And there are people who sort of point to the old libertarian arguments and say the unions are fundamentally instruments of the left. They distort the market in all these ways, and we should be anti-union because to be anti-union is to be pro-people and pro-conservatism. And then you have sort of these newfangled conservatives, a lot of whom are my friends, who say, look, unions are a place where the common people who have been dispossessed by our elites can actually come together and acquire some bargaining power. We should be supporting unions for that purpose. And to both of them, I say, sometimes you're right and sometimes you're wrong, right? Sometimes unions serve very useful functions and sometimes they don't. And why do we have to be so ideological about this? Why don't we just be realistic, get out of the abstractions and into the real world? Here's a union I really like, because this is another thing conservatives will say, well, I like unions, but I really hate public sector unions. You know what union I really like? The Fraternal Order of Police, a public sector union. And you know why I like the Fraternal Order of Police? Is because they are the most powerful institution in our society, standing between barbarism. When people burn down buildings and loot and murder, it is the police that prevent them from doing so. And it's the Fraternal Order of Police that ensures they don't lose their job for doing their job. They don't lose their livelihoods for doing their job. They don't go to prison for doing their job. That's why I like the fraternal order of police. I don't give a damn what abstract arguments you give against public sector unions. I like people who stand on the line between civilization and barbarians. It's that simple. And you should too. I'm telling you right now that in the actual world of politics that we live, the people who are doing the most to ensure the criminals don't take over our cities are maybe the police and the people who represent them. So don't give me your crap about public sector unions. The fraternal order of police are the good guys, and conservatives should be fighting for them because we believe in civilization. We believe in beauty. We believe you should be able to walk down the street without getting mugged or murdered, and that's why we support the cops. Let me give you another example. I had a meeting where I think the leader who met with me was not very well briefed. I won't name his name because I don't want to embarrass the guy, but he came into my office. It was very early during my Senate term. He was one of the leaders of the major American airlines. And he said, Senator, I just want you to know that we're very committed to the principles of diversity, equity, and inclusion in our flying workforce. And I said, oh, that's interesting. Whichever staffer prepared you for this meeting, they should get fired because you were not talking to the right guy, my friend. But he said something really, really interesting to me. He said that they really want to diversify the pilot workforce. They would really like to increase the number of young people that they have working as pilots, and that sounds pretty good to me. But then he said that there are actually people that he would like to be pilots, and he thinks they would actually make excellent pilots, but they don't satisfy the standards that have been set to become pilots, okay? And I'm the father of 3 kids, a 6-year-old, a 3-year-old, and a 1-year-old. There are 2 jobs that I really, really want to be merit-based and nothing else. One is surgeons and 2 is airline pilots, okay? I want the smartest and the best people. I don't care what they look like. I don't care what their background is. And the thing this guy said to me is actually, if you think about it, I would like to have less qualified people flying your children around in the name of diversity. That's insane. Whatever my politics are, I'm against that. I want the most qualified people to be flying the children of Americans all across our country. Now, you know what else he said to me that was pretty interesting? Is that the people who were standing in his way, and I think this is where he sort of thought maybe I was just a conventional Republican. He said, the people who are standing in his way, the people who are most aggressively preventing him from hiring a more diverse workforce within the pilot corps were the airline unions. Okay? I didn't know shit about the airline unions, and then I became their biggest fan. That moment. Okay? Again, I'm not talking about abstractions. I'm not talking about Hayekian arguments about bargaining power and workers. I'm talking about the people who want to make sure we have the most qualified pilots. Those are my people, and I'm going to be on their side going forward. And in each of these arguments, if you really think about it, we got to get less abstract and we got to focus on the things that actually matter. So my third and final point that I will leave you with, and I'll repeat it, is stop caring so much about ideas. Ideas really matter, but start caring about how we can win and the alliances that we have to form in order to win. I will be as much of an ally as I can be, and I know you guys will reciprocate. God bless you in your efforts. Thank you. And okay. So if you have a question, I'll take like 2 or 3 questions. Just speak loudly. I'll answer them quickly, and then I'll get out of here unless you guys get on with the rest of the conference. Anybody? Mike Anton has a lot to say. Mike, you have a question? Anybody? Question in the back. Please, sir, be loud.
I love your point about the fraternal order of police as well as the airline unions in cases where they were absolutely correct. Now, I would assume that I know your answer on this, but in cases where those unions are wrong, you're not going to, they're only your people on a case-by-case basis, correct?
Look, that's exactly right. I think that there are good unions and there are bad unions, and we have to be honest about that fact. Do I have a special amount of affection for the Starbucks baristas union, where they're currently using their power not to bargain for higher wages, but to come out and support the terrorists of Hamas, right? But this is what I mean about getting too abstract about this stuff. And the criticism I would give to my friends on the right who tend to be more pro-union is, if your politics lead you to defend the baristas union as they defend Hamas, then you should have a different politics. It's really that simple. Again, some of these institutions are good, some of these institutions are bad, and the only way you can really figure it out is to do the work, get on the ground, meet with people, try to create alliances, and figure out how it goes from there. Sir in the back.
So But does it not still matter the precise things that we do? So, for example, with the tech companies, yes, the tech companies were involved in the censorship, but we now have pretty definitive proof that this all came from the DOJ at some level. So do you think it might be a mistake to turn our ire on the private sector when they have the sort of Damocles of regulation hanging over them all the time, and it does come from the deep state on some level, even though our results in the past going after the deep state have been disappointing?
Well, I think the on some level part of your question is really important, right? It came from the deep state on some level. We certainly know that the FBI was explicitly participating in some of the censorship regime in the run up to the 2020 election. But look, we also know these guys were doing it in part of their own volition. The FBI wasn't making Mark Zuckerberg write $425 million to left-wing ballot harvesting initiatives, right? My point here, again, to go back to the abstraction point, is we have to recognize good versus evil, right versus wrong, and not allow a particular principle to hamstring us from doing what's actually in the interest of the American people. Because if, you know, as Anton Chigurh says, if the rule has led you to this point, at what use was the rule? Okay. My point is, if the rule has led us to that point, we have to be willing to think of some different rules to apply here. And you're absolutely right. We have to be mindful of the deep state. On the censorship stuff, if I would sort of allot responsibility, I'd probably say 70% of it was deep state, 30% of it was private actor. That's a guess in my head, but that means that we have to be willing to sort of push back on both fronts if we actually want to end the censorship complex in this country, and I certainly do. One more question? Sir.
Yeah, your comments kind of remind me of Carl Schmitt's idea that politics is about who's the enemy.
Well, look, I'm hardly an expert in Carl Schmitt, and I actually am pretty ecumenical in that I think that most of our fellow Americans are not the enemy. I think it's really important that we distinguish between the leadership of the left and the rank and file Democratic voter. I think most of whom actually, I genuinely do believe this. I'm not just a hopeless optimist. I think most rank and file Democrats are pretty good people. I think the leadership of the left has gone completely insane. And certainly when I'm talking about restoring civic order, bringing back a meaningful border, raising the wages of Americans, just bringing back like the basic good things that we all care about in the conservative movement, then certainly there are people on the left that are actively aligned against it. And I'm not afraid to call them out for that fact. Thank you. Thank you for having me, Arthur. Thanks for organizing. God bless you guys, and I hope to see you all soon. See ya.
Thank you very much, Senator Vance. Joining me now is Michael Anton, contributor to the edited volume, former communications director at the National Security Council and currently a senior fellow at the Claremont Institute. Jeremy Carl, former deputy assistant secretary in the Department of the Interior and a senior fellow at the Claremont Institute. And Matt Peterson, who is the founding editor of The American Mind. He's looking at me to make sure I get this right. Founder of a venture firm and currently the executive editor of Blaze Media. We will start with Michael Anton, please.
Push something? I guess I do. So I won't read to you. I'll just keep it here so I can see it. These are Arthur's instructions to me as to what to talk about. He doesn't actually have any power of the purse over me, so I can probably say what I want. He doesn't have a lot of recourse, but I try to be a good colleague and do what's asked of me. So he wants me to talk about how the left, first of all, how it took over everything, why it's held on so tightly, and what we can do to, shake it Okay, so how? I'm actually researching this a bit now. There have been a million books written about this. You can find them easily. Roger Kimball's The Long March, picking up a phrase from the Chinese Civil War in the 1930s. Anyway, but I got to give you an analogy of how, because I'm researching this for another purpose, and one of the things I'm looking at is, for reasons I won't go into, the history of student takeovers of buildings in the 60s and thereafter, when this became a thing. Like you go into the building, you have a sit-in, you occupy, you have some kind of demand. Eventually, typically, I would say more than typically, probably 99 out of 100 times, the university caves and gives you everything you want. There's even a movie that I recently watched about this that I had never heard of, and it was called The Strawberry Statement, totally forgotten, 1970. It's about a sit-in at an unnamed Bay Area university. How did they do it? Well, if you read about it, they're actually fairly clever. Most of these buildings, at least in those days, they're just open, right? There's a bunch of different doors. You walk in, you got to file your papers. There's got a lot of reasons to be in there. So you have a conspiracy with 200-300 people beforehand, and you trickle in over the course of a few hours. And once you've reached critical mass, you sit down, you block the doors, you start chanting, you break out the signs, and so on and so forth. But just one at a time, you go in. This is the way that they, in effect, took over. You do it very quietly. You don't announce your intent until you have physical control. This is the way, in a sense, that the left took over a lot of our institutions. Nobody comes in saying, we're going to take over the university and make it into a left-wing anti-American hate fest. It's just you hire one person at a time as quietly as possible. Only when you have critical mass does the real agenda reveal itself. Or in another context, similar, but and this is an anecdote I approve of, some of our friends and teacher, a Harvard professor, retired now, named Harvey Mansfield, had to keep his head down for a long time until he got tenure in 1965. And when he got tenure, he wrote a telegram, that's how long ago this was, to his mentor, Leo Strauss. It says, achieved, or I forgot exactly what the word was, but I definitely remember the second sentence. And there were only two sentences, one word, like achieved. And then the second was, now we run up the Jolly Roger. In other words, now that you can't touch me, back then tenure was taken seriously, now I will reveal who I really am, and I'll start giving Harvard a headache on a daily basis, which he managed to do for about 40 years, 60 years, I should say. So this is the way they take it over, very slowly, right? Under the guise of fairness, freedom, free speech, and so on. When there's critical mass, then you announce yourself and you change the rules, in a sense. If anybody wants to get really depressed, don't recommend, but read what it's like on a university hiring committee these days, or what you have to do to pass muster to get hired. Forget to get hired. Just to get an interview, just to get past the first round in a university committee, it's almost impossible. And it's changed extremely rapidly just in the past, let's say, 3 years. Okay, why have they held on? Well, okay, I think that was part 2 of my charge. They've held on because they waited to achieve critical mass. And once you've achieved critical mass in a given institution, you can be fairly hard to dislodge. So who's going to kick them out now of the universities or of the major newspapers or of the foundations or of, I've worked at 3 Fortune 50 companies. Now you would think, this is to piggyback on something Senator Vance said, you'd think these people, these companies, these institutions, because they're profit making, right? They have to be responsive to the bottom line. They have to be responsive to investor concerns. They have to be responsive for the public who buys their product. And yet they're overwhelmingly just as left-wing. They're not quite as bad as, let's say, a women's studies department at Oberlin College, but there's more in common with a Fortune 50 boardroom and a mid-tier sociology department than you might think. We've seen some positive signs recently. Disney appears to be suffering because of pushing too much woke fare, alienating its customer base, and so on. I'm trying to see the light at the end of the tunnel in that. I guess Bud Light suffered, Anheuser-Busch via Bud Light has suffered a little bit. Mostly, though, these companies haven't paid a price. And because once there's critical mass, there aren't a lot of levers. There's almost nothing you can do from the inside. And there aren't really that many levers that you can utilize from the outside. To take the universities, for example, the main lever people would have over the universities is boycotting them. Don't send your kids there. Don't pay the tuition. I can tell you from experience, as someone who's a big sap that I am, paying the tuition right now for one of these places, like no one's doing that. No one is yet willing to say to their kid, don't go there, or I refuse to let you go there, or anything. Nobody's boycotting and we'll see what happens to Harvard and Penn and MIT. They appear to be going through a rough patch. One of them, I think, is right now without a president. Maybe 2 more soon will be, although I think Claudine Gay is going to survive at Harvard. That's my estimation. But, hey, they haven't suffered like this in a long time. So maybe that's something to look forward to or something to be optimistic about. Another reason, though, why they hang on is because they've seized, I mean this only in the sense of perception, right? They've seized the moral high ground. They occupy the moral high ground. Not literally. I don't think they hold the actually true moral position, but they sound like they do. And they're always able to couch whatever they want or whatever they do or whatever their priority is or whatever this action that appears to the rest of us to be hypocritical, they're always able to couch it in terms that sound extremely moral so that the regular person that Senator Vance was talking about, not the think tank egghead, right? Not the engaged political participant, not the campaign volunteer, the regular constituency who just wants the chemical train explosion in their town cleaned up, when they hear this moral language, they go, yeah, it sounds fair. That's about right, right? And the egghead comes in and let me write. I can write 10,000 words about why my vision of justice is different from theirs. It doesn't get through, right? The moral revolution in the way we're supposed to understand the relationship between privilege and non-privilege, between the underdog and entrenched power and all of that, gives them an incredibly effective tool, even when people sort of have misgivings. Like, should the 6'2", 210-pound hulking person of ambiguous gender actually be competing against 5'4" biological women? You know, common sense says, nah, probably not. That doesn't seem right. But if you frame it as a moral issue, as the civil rights imperative of our time, as I think the president called it before he was president, and if you guilt people and shame them into thinking that, you know, you're against progress, you're against the disadvantaged, they can kind of, I think maybe not fully genuinely, but they can be made to feel misgivings that overcome their common sense. And at a minimum, if it doesn't fully convert them to this cause, it makes them kind of recede into the background and say, well, I'm not going to raise a stink about that because it makes me look bad, and I'm actually not even sure that I'm wrong. So holding that moral high ground or that moral whip hand is very important. What could we do against all of this? Well, since we're in Capitol Hill, we're in the Capitol, or I don't know, we're underground somewhere. I can think of two things that members of Congress could and should do that they almost never do, right? One is just don't give them any money, right? You have power of the purse. I teach a class, we all do. I teach for Hillsdale College, and we're all supposed to know something about the Constitution. Well, it's somewhere in Article 1. It says that not only does only the Congress, that is the Senate and the House of Representatives, have the power of the purse, only ultimately the House of Representatives has the power of the purse, right? I can show you where this is. If you don't give them any money, they can't spend any money. And yet whenever some controversial, horrible thing comes up, or the worst behaving departments in the US government, the senator just mentioned the Department of Justice, right, which controls, among other things, the FBI. Whenever one of their bills comes up, the Republicans always vote to give them more money, right? So they gave the FBI some huge raise. I'm not going to say the number because I'll forget it, and then everyone will jump on me. You know, you were one digit off or whatever. Not only did they expand their budget, but they all voted. I'm sure some people voted no, but anyway, it passed to build them a gigantic new sparkly headquarters in the DC area, right? Given all the malfeasance we've seen come out about this particular agency in the last 7 years, they don't deserve any of this, and yet the Republicans can't stop it, right? And even if you can't stop it, I would say if there are any Republican members in the room, I'm looking at you, even if you can't stop it, at least vote no, just symbolically. Just put yourself on the record saying, okay, this is going to get smashed through anyway. There's nothing I can do. The leadership is for it. They've got the votes, whatever. But I, in good conscience, can't put my name on it. But they always go along. And we could point to a million more examples of things that Republican elected officials know are wrong, that their constituents don't support, that if it was explained to those constituents, they would especially not support, and Republicans pay for it repeatedly anyway. The other power, this is really more for the Senate side, although there are levers that the House side could push, is over personnel. Stop voting to confirm people who say they're going to do bad things in the US government. So again, J.D. Vance teed this up for me. Thank you, Senator, right? He was talking about airline pilots. Well, we have a sort of similar issue on the military side where the last chief of staff of the U.S. Air Force recently became the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. It's the highest uniform position in the United States military. And he said, and one of his top, if not his top priority as Air Force Chief of Staff, and it will continue to be as the head of, well, he's not really the head of the whole military. It's complicated the way the Joint Staff operates. But you know, his priority is to diversify these ranks. Now, as the senator said, fine with that as long as we're diversifying consistent with high standards and high without any diminution of standards, without any lowering of qualifications. But when that just diversity for its own sake becomes a priority, you're no longer selecting for that, you're going to have a problem. So this general was very loudly, clearly on the record what he wanted to do, and big stink raised, a lot of outrage, a lot of concern, a lot of controversy. And what happens in the end? The Republicans all just roll over, and he was confirmed with like 85 votes or something. I forgot what it was, but it was over 80. Nobody stands up and says no, right? Either say that you're not going to do this, that you're going to prioritize qualifications, readiness, the ability to defend the United States, carry out military missions, or you don't get our vote. But we lay down every time. So these are things that could be done from this building by the elected members who serve in this building in complete accordance and keeping with the constitutional duties of their offices and with the oath that they take. And in my humble opinion, having never served in Congress and never will, they too seldom do those things. And I, for one, would like to see them do it just occasionally would be a good start, and then increasingly, and then universally.
Thank you. Jeremy Carl.
Thanks very much, Arthur. So I flew up here from Montana over the weekend. I'm going to talk about immigration a little bit. And on the way back from the airport, I had an Uber driver from Afghanistan, and I like to chat up drivers. So I was just sort of talking with him, and we had a really good talk. And I asked where I'm from. I said I'm from Montana. He said, "Oh, I have friends in Missoula." And I actually knew about that because we had a recent resettlement of 130 Afghan refugees in Missoula. And Montana being a small state and not a particularly diverse state, that was sort of a newsworthy event, a significant number of refugees. And sure enough, not that long later, there was a rape case involving one of those refugees. Now, we never consented for that refugee resettlement, although this was legal immigration. You know, I did do. Congressman Rosendale from Montana had actually objected to it. The governor objected. But honestly, there's not much we can do. And I'm sitting here in Montana saying, well, do we control our own country? Do we control who really comes here? And I really think it underscores to me that immigration is the fundamental issue, the first issue that transcends all other issues, because it goes to really the heart of who are we as a people, and do we get to choose? And it's a battle that I think we as a nation right now are losing. In October of this year, we hit 15% immigrant population in the United States. That is the highest in history, higher even than the Ellis Island era. And that's both legal and illegal. And it wasn't always this way. I mean, even not before I was born. 1970 census, we were 4.7% immigrant. In 1960, the median age of immigrants was 57. Median age of native-born Americans was 27. So you had few older immigrants, and that was kind of it. 84% of those immigrants came from Europe and Canada. Today, we have immigrants, legal and illegal, from everywhere in the world. Under Joe Biden, we've had a 4.5 million net increase. That's according to the Census Bureau. Estimated 2.5 million, according to my friends at the Center for Immigration Studies, of those are illegal. Those numbers are historically absolutely unprecedented, that type of increase. Got away numbers, similar thing. We have 137,000 per month right now encounters at the border. That's bigger than the biggest city in Montana. We had about 42,000 a month by comparison under Trump, which is hardly zero, but you're talking about a more than 3x increase. It's even twice as many as we had under Obama. So it's a dramatic change. It's not business as usual. Now, of immigrants who become citizens, more than 60% of them are Democrats, just a quarter are Republicans. You do the math of what that looks like. So given the importance of the issue, I'm going to just talk about four different things. One, I'm going to talk about the conceptual big picture. Secondly, because we're on the Hill, I'm going to give you a few thoughts on what we can do with current legislation, followed by sort of long-term strategic goals, and finally, sort of long-term practical things that we could do if we have the White House and when we have the White House again. Conceptual big picture, how should we think about this from the perspective of Congress if we want to make change? Well, absent substantial changes for immigration law, not just enforcement promises, but law, we shouldn't be doing any deals. Any solution that gives discretion to the immigration bureaucracy, I think we fundamentally lose. If we create new law, we might win. If we create facts on the ground, then we win. And we shouldn't put our trust in fences. Right now on our side of the border in Arizona, we've got huge numbers of illegal aliens camped out, basically waiting to be picked up and to have their bogus asylum claims, and they almost all are bogus, processed and to just disappear into the interior. So having a wall, I'm not trying to say having a wall is not important, it is, but it is far from sufficient. Policy is more important than a wall, and personnel is more important than policy. That's how I think about immigration most broadly. So what does that mean short-term practically in terms of the current bill we have sort of in front of us right now, the current debate? We've had immigration twinned with Ukraine. There's been a lot of discussion about whether that is kind of useful or not. Even Mitt Romney is kind of saying, no deal, on anything with immigration if you want your Ukraine money. If that's true, if we can really get everything we want that was basically in HR 2 in this Ukraine bill, then fine. That's a trade I'm willing to make. But if not, I just know our history as a party. I'm really worried we're going to give up fundamental things and then as a result give also tens of billions of dollars to Ukraine, with regardless of the merits of it, is not something that is popular with an increasing number of GOP voters. So what should be the things in that sort of a bill? One, I think parole is the most important thing. So you have to reform the parole issue because that's how you actually release people into the interior and then they're kind of never seen again functionally. It's much more important than asylum, and it's not a coincidence that the Democrats have been willing to do deals on asylum, but not really parole. Secondly, some of the smaller loopholes when you deal with asylum, things like credible fear and what a particular social group means in the law, whether that means domestic violence or being in a bad neighborhood is included in that, which we should certainly say no. Those are things the Democrats have even indicated they have some willingness to move on. Obviously, those are mandatory. Again, I'm going to get a little bit wonky, but the Flores loophole change, TThe, PRA, things where basically these both involve what you deal with minors. The idea that if a minor is not from Mexico or Canada, we can't do anything with them if they show up, as opposed to what we should do, which is just call up their embassy and be like, hey, we've got somebody from your country, you need to go deal with them. Similarly to Flores, right now, basically a judge for the last long period of time has made it that if you show up with a minor, it's basically a get out of jail free card and your whole family, if it's even a family in every case, gets released into the interior. We can stop that legislatively. And to me, those are sort of minimum goals that we should have. We can dramatically increase the enforcement budget. Much of the completely ridiculous things that the Democrats do on immigration, or they say, oh, well, we're just using our discretion. So if you give them a ton of money to actually just for enforcement, then the discretion argument becomes a little bit harder to swallow. Finally, we should empower states to enforce immigration laws. You're seeing a little bit of this, particularly down in Texas, in Florida, a little bit in Arizona. Will the Democrats really risk with our current border? Are they going to send federal troops down to Texas and say, we're going to start arresting and I knew Michael was going to say yes, arresting people who are just trying to enforce the federal laws that they won't enforce? I think they may try. But I think if we're smart, we can make the optics of that so bad that it becomes toxic even for the Democrats. So that's short term. Create facts on the ground. What do we do long term conceptually? Well, first, I think we have to puncture the nation of immigrants myth. That's literally has its origins in a Democrat campaign slogan in 1960. If you read my chapter in the book, I kind of go all into sort of the history of American immigration, which is not what most people think it is. So you can see some of my other talks on YouTube. We also need to have a candid look at what worked and what didn't work under Trump. Under Trump, deportations increased. The border was certainly more secure. Remain in Mexico policy kept hundreds of thousands of bogus asylum claims from being adjudicated here. Refugee numbers went down to 15,000 from a high of 80,000 or so in the Obama administration. Parts of the border wall were strengthened. That's all good. But there was little fundamental long-term change, despite really smart people and folks like Stephen Miller giving really good efforts. There was no mass deportation of illegals. There was no meaningful legislation passed, again, despite efforts. Most of these accomplishments under Trump have been undone and more by President Biden. We even failed, again, not through lack of trying, to end Obama's blatantly unconstitutional DACA executive order. So I think there's no way we can win ultimately on this immigration issue if we simply play under the current rigged system. And this kind of gets back to the old way of doing conservatism, in which advocacy groups, resettlement agencies, and lawfare kind of dominate policy. So what's a solution? Well, we can take a page from President Lincoln. And President Lincoln, and you start by doing things like challenging the power of district judges. This is now if we control the White House, to issue nationwide injunctions when they don't like something. Lincoln argued against judicial supremacy in the Civil War. He took Dred Scott. He took ex parte Merriman when the court attempted to limit his authority. And he said, basically, with good legal opinions, he said, you know what, I'm just not going to do that. That's nice that you have that opinion. And that means that what you need, Noah Feldman of Harvard Law has argued that even the Emancipation Proclamation was probably a constitutional violation. Certainly not a moral violation, but a constitutional violation. So the question is, are we going to talk about the left's version of a constitutional violation, or are we going to make the correct legal arguments to do the things that we know are the right thing to do? We need to rescue that spirit of Lincoln. That also means my number one priority is an aggressive White House counsel's office in the next administration. People are really going to be unafraid to kind of push for these very fundamental changes. So on a policy perspective, what do? You de-bureaucratize immigration claims. You take authority away from immigration judges, quote unquote, they're not real judges. You do things, simple things even, like for asylum claims, everything is heard by 3 asylum judges. You need all of them to say yes before you can get in. Even just doing that little thing would get rid of a lot of bogus things. We need to remove the temporary protected status program entirely, as opposed to kind of doing this country by country thing. We've got 400,000 illegals right now, people who wouldn't be here illegally, except they've been given temporary protected status. What does temporary mean? Well, it's running on 34 years for Somalis, 25 for Hondurans, 25 years for Nicaraguans, 15 years for Haiti. Doesn't really feel so temporary at this point. Finally, I'd say we need to consider, and this really gets to things that Senator Vance would say, what I would call the nuclear option. And this is really an up from conservatism thing, from a conservatism that always loses. I think the Department of Justice, day one of our next administration, needs to open up a January 6th style investigation of the activities of the Biden administration and immigration and their state enablers, and criminally prosecute, if they find appropriate evidence, administration officials who have broken their oath of office and intentionally violated the law. And I'm very, very confident, by the way, that if you start doing FOIA communications, you're going to find a lot of things where you're gonna have that happen, from Secretary Mayorkas on down. And I want to be clear, what I'm talking about here is not criminalizing policy disagreement, okay? The left is not going to agree with us on immigration policy, and that's fine. I'm talking about prosecuting the criminal behavior that is going on right now of the Biden administration, who refuses to enforce the duly enacted laws of the United States because they feel that it will hurt them politically. And until you do that, until you make people personally pay on the left for blatantly flouting laws, not just by losing an election, but by losing their freedom, you're going to have the same sorts of bad acting from the left that you always have had. There need to be real consequences for Democrats who engage in the sort of criminal behavior that we have seen, unfortunately, from this administration and their enablers, often at the state level. And when you do that, when you have those sorts of real consequences, you're going to get the change you need. So with that.
Thank you, Jeremy. Matt Peterson.
So anyone paying attention now knows that in America, there's very few elite professions or corporations allow their members to safely dissent from woke dogma. Everyone knows this. Everyone knows they risk their job or career if they do so publicly. Worse, we know the views of roughly half the country are increasingly opposed, suppressed, delegitimized by major corporations in key sectors like tech, finance, and media. As we learn more and more every day, big corporate increasingly works directly with the administrative state to spy on and deplatform, debank, unperson, and otherwise attack dissenting political, cultural organizations, citizens, and political movements. That's where we're at. So first off, it's suffice it to say, if we're going to talk about the economic war, we've already lost this battle, right? We did something wrong. We've lost big corporate. That was supposed to be Republican. It's gone. So now this is a time we have to, and this is what this book is about, we have to wholly rethink our approach if we're going to have any hope of winning. So the way I look at this is there's no easy path to victory. But there is a clear strategy moving forward. It's not complicated. But victory is not going to be possible unless we first boldly and publicly acknowledge that our economy is a political and cultural war zone and act accordingly. So Arthur, he gave me two conflicting orders. One was to keep it within the time, and the other was to explain how we got here. I'm gonna skip the how we got here part and go to the other half, what we should do. But suffice it to say, I am very confident in arguing that the founders, the Republican Party of Abraham Lincoln, the Whig Party, Henry Clay, the American system, Teddy Roosevelt, all of those people in the past did not talk about business the way that we do now. It is very new to consider business a neutral space, and they would have issues with the way in which the conservative movement has talked about it post-World War II. But let's look forward. There's two paths forward. One is, it's a pincer movement, if we're going to stop woke capital. One is legal and political action, and the other is a new commercial cultural movement, intense competition, and radical accelerated innovation. I'm going to speak mainly about the first today because of where we are. I think the second is ultimately the way you win, but the first, the political and legal action, is necessary to hasten and unleash the second. So the first line of attack, the first thing we should talk about is very simple, and I can't really emphasize this enough. People, very smart people in this space, do not grasp this in the way that they should. Internalize it. We need to use the weapons that are already available to us. Here's one of the big problems. Until recently, the right just hasn't tried very hard at this stuff. And there's no greater example of this than what has been going on in the last few weeks in your daily headlines. So listen to this. This is probably more important than any of the intellectual stuff I say. Elon Musk recently said this, quote, "Media Matters is an evil propaganda machine. We are suing them in every country in which they operate, and we will pursue not only Media Matters, but anyone who funds Media Matters. They should go to hell, and I hope they do." This is a guy who also declared war on Disney, right? That's the right mindset if you want to win the war. You don't bend, you don't break, you go on the attack instead. And people know this. The voters know this. Musk has become a hero to half the nation. But here's my point. As soon as Musk sued Media Matters, right, in the last few weeks, he inspired a host of right-leaning media companies and tech companies to follow suit, to do the same. And more are going to follow his lead. Okay, so why didn't we do that years ago? Why haven't we done that already? Everyone's going to follow his lead because he planted the flag and he did something. And the truth is, whether it's free speech, whether it's antitrust, whether it's tortious interference, whether it's common carrier laws and regulations, there are plenty of avenues already available to protect consumers and attack the corporations now wielding power against them to further their political agenda. The lack of will to deploy them is, in my opinion, our first problem. So if you jettison the blinders of the past and you engage in a kind of full-scale economic war that corporations are already waging against the other side, against us, you will unleash the talent and creativity of politicians, policymakers, and lawyers at a much greater scale with much greater effectiveness than anything we've seen so far. And that's already happening. We need more of it. There's been state attorney generals in states like Texas, Florida, Missouri, elsewhere. They've proven that you can win using the framework of existing law, whether it's filing suits against Google for antitrust violations or the Biden administration for colluding with big tech. These things are popular with voters and even many donors alike. So if you join the fight, that's the first step. Use existing law. Second, there's plenty of areas in which new or radically reformed laws and regulations can reshape the commercial landscape for the better. Obvious measures pushing anti-ESG legislation, forbidding banks from discriminating against their customers. Red states have to stop giving billions of taxpayer dollars to corporations that hate them. That means pulling out large amounts of money now in the hands of BlackRock and other large investment vehicles that have weaponized the trillions of dollars they control. There's been some headway there, but that needs to become the norm across the nation for the right. Same principle should apply to all large state contracts with notable businesses that oppose and attack the interests of American citizens and state residents. All special arrangements and giveaways that state and local governments have designed in the past for corporations, given to them, corporations that are actively opposing the interest of their residents, of American citizens, we need to re-examine those special carve-outs, right, and take them back. The idea that that action violates conservative principles is so absurd to me. I mean, strict libertarians have been talking for decades that special cutouts for businesses distort what should be a level playing field, right? So getting rid of them should be applauded. What DeSantis did should be applauded with Disney. The entire complicated landscape of our free market is already a distorted and corrupt war zone, with states like California and New York ceaselessly rewarding their friends and punishing their enemies. That's what they do. So fighting against this will raise awareness of the problem, and if you do some of the things I just mentioned above, you'll also create an ecosystem where you can foster and reward alternative businesses and financial institutions that aren't doing these things, right? Which can start capturing market share from their competitors, the worst offenders. Another thing, obvious but needs to be done. It's starting to happen, but not enough. In the past, we relied on the discipline of boards and shareholders as a trustworthy lever to limit the political activity of a company, right? But many corporate boards have long since been co-opted by activists. Acknowledge the reality. The real impetus behind the cries for diversity on corporate boards in California and elsewhere is simply to leverage power for political purposes. And you have a tangled web of NGOs, politicians, political organizations. They've succeeded over the years to take over, I mean, think about this, even the industries they despise, such as the energy sector. So there's no reason, the good news is there's no reason in principle that nonprofits, politicians, political organizations on the right could act in a similar manner to the left in this arena. There's only lack of will. There's tons of examples I could take, but to take one example of something that could exist that would put the right pressure, why isn't there a consumers union right now that represents tech platform users and advocates on their behalf? Harmeet Dillon and I proposed that in 2019. She didn't have time, and neither did I. But such an organization would file a few high-profile lawsuits a year. It would break down the ever-changing terms of service. It would educate consumers about their rights and tech privacy practices, rank social media platforms, call attention to their worst actions, right? It'd be like a legit version of a Media Matters, actually serving people. Consumers Union, the idea's been around forever. Where is that? That's just one example. There's a ton of new things like that we could see coming and we need to foster. But here's the controversial and the most important thing that I'll say about the legal and political problem. And the thing that Congress must do to fight off woke capital is address its root legal cause. No one talks about this. That's our corrupted civil rights regime. Why are companies woke? It's baked into the cake. Our laws, our institutions, and our culture have long since baked in the necessity of allegiance to elite-sponsored wokeness and identity politics. Although the initial Civil Rights Act was sold to Americans as a way to ensure we judge individuals by the content of their merits, it metastasized into a system based on the opposite notion. By law, all workplaces must now take racial and many other identities into account, and they hire, fire, and promote people accordingly. The system is not neutral. Moreover, it's partly run not just by the woke commissars in the businesses, but by an ideological federal administrative state and its corollaries in the individual states themselves. So, here's the hard news. There can be no real victory until the right takes aim at the massive body of rules and regulations that emerged and created the woke human resources regime, wrongly established on the basis of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. That provides the commissars their command centers in every major business in America. It's become a tyrannical tool of radical ideology. We all know this. We must no longer require that race and other identities be taken into account in the workplace. Now, I know what you're thinking. Dismantling that complex is such a monumental task that many would despair at the attempt. But there's no longer any way around fighting the weaponization of race and sexual identities in the workplace. If there's no way around it. If there's any hope of saving America, that's what you have to do. At the very least, okay, after saying the most radical thing, at the very least, the concept of disparate interest, which practically means that any inequality is the result of oppression and must be rectified accordingly, needs to be publicly dismantled by revisiting and revising all of that Civil Rights Act legislation that's been wrongfully built upon the 1964 Act. The right can rest assured that despite the success of its enemies, millions of regular Americans and business leaders still value excellence and despise the working environment they now find themselves in. They want to get out of it. What's required to help them is a brave new political movement that takes direct aim at that body of law. And to do that, you have to accurately describe the problem. You have to reject the rhetorical straitjacket the left has put us in for decades. The framework we're talking about has nothing to do with race or sexuality, but the question of whether we still value excellence and competence. So we need to argue that woke HR is not merely inefficient, but it's fundamentally unjust and morally wrong. Now think about this. Again, I'm going to go back to Musk to shame the right. The most successful businessman in the world recently declared, unless it is stopped, the woke mind virus will destroy civilization and humanity will never reach Mars.
If Republicans can't say the same and explain why and act on that, they should not expect to defeat woke capital, and they don't exist to deserve as a political party, in my opinion. If, however, Republican leaders begin to take action, and we see some signs of this, if they start taking the sort of political and legal action, rethink the framework of how they talk about these things, and they start to move in this direction, which the new right is trying to push, that will serve the purpose not of, on its own, defeating the enemy, but it will unleash the other side of the pincer movement we need. It'll hasten the rise of a new commercial cultural movement in the private sector based on competition, innovation, and excellence. People have already started to get out from under the control of woke capital. The same forces driving geographic migration that you see right now from blue to red states apply even more so, with even more force, to the one-party controlled workplace, marketplace, and digital technology platforms. Any way you count the numbers, you have millions of people who as a group would constitute one of the largest GDPs in the world who want to stop supporting companies and cultural institutions that hate them. Half the nation wants alternatives. I'm part of that movement in the private sector now, expanding Blaze Media, which will increasingly shine a light on all the above. There's a lot of work to do. Members of the private sector need to be roused and given a vision and purpose, and the political action that I'm suggesting could help that. But ultimately, only they can put together the historic levels of talent now available that wants to break out to meet the increasingly ravenous demand of people for the new tech, media, and financial institutions we need. And that's not only the single largest business opportunity in our lifetimes, that's also how we're going to save America. Thanks.
Thank you. Give our panelists a round of applause, please. Rather than break for an intermission, in the interest of staying on time, I'd like to welcome our next panelist, please. Thank you very much. Well, welcome back, everyone. I hope you liked your intermission. I would like to pick up right where we left off and turn to Congressman Bishop. And discuss what Matt Peterson talked about, which is the problem of our understanding of the economy, that it is a neutral space, which effectively has meant for the past generation that the left makes advances and the right stands idly by. Now, Congressman, you have been interested in antitrust laws and thinking about ESG from that perspective. Could you talk a little bit about that, please?
Well, I joined Chairman Jordan of the Judiciary Committee back in July, asking for information from Vanguard and I think BlackRock and some other entities on the degree to which there's an agreement in restraint of trade concerning decarbonization and the like, all the ESG initiatives. And I will just say that I think it's today there's an announcement that Chairman Jordan has followed that up because what's been forthcoming is limited, and so subpoenas have been issued to Vanguard and Aruna Capital, and I think that it's it seems like something that's been obvious. It's staring us in the face, and the question is just whether we're going to permit it to go on endlessly, or as you say, it is an economic war being waged by means of by unfair means. Agreements in restraint of trade must be responded to by Congress, and committees in Congress can find out what's been going on, and then we'll see what happens after that.
And what must some of your colleagues here think who would be on our side in principle, but discourage you from pursuing this? I mean, do they think that things will simply normalize in time?
I think generally about your thesis, Arthur, and some of the materials I've seen. I saw your interview with Kevin Roberts, and I think there is, look, I've been in Congress since 2019. One of the things you said is that maybe we need to look to states. I agree with that. I'm leaving Congress to go run to be Attorney General of North Carolina for exactly the reason you're talking about. I think as a general theme, the problem is there's a lack of will, a lack of courage in people who've served in Congress for far too long and who are nominally conservative, and that's got to change. And so it's a matter of using this timidity in responding to an all-out assault on the American way of life by a radicalized left cannot be, it is not a solution. And so, yeah, I think that you've got to pick, use tools that we've been reticent about, and if people are scandalized by that, well, I'm sorry, that's just too bad.
Thank you. Representative Babin, we talked about immigration a little bit. I just have a basic question. Why does the right always talk about doing something about immigration and never does anything? You've seen it from the inside. Tell us.
Absolutely. When I got elected in 14, and I sit on committees that really don't have jurisdiction. Unlike Dan, I don't sit on judiciary. But it's such a major issue, and especially being from the state of Texas. It is. I think it's the most important issue that we face as far as danger, because the imminent danger that an open border has for us is just overwhelming. And quite frankly, just as Dan said, we don't have 100% will in the Republican Party to secure the borders. The Democrat Party certainly does not want to have secure borders, because they see this as a political thing. This is a source of votes, a source of chaos to inflict upon the country with a Marxist intention of nihilism, anarchy. Marxists pick up the pieces routinely. You look at your history books. This is the way they operate. And quite frankly, the House of Representatives, I was so proud, having served on my fifth term, we passed H.R. 2, which I think is historically, I think it's the toughest, best border security bill that has come out of the Congress in modern times. And unfortunately, it's withering and gathering dust over in the Senate, because the Democrats are in control there. And in his paper, Michael Antone said, we're so blinkered by ideology that we can't or won't apply obvious solutions to simple problems. We know it. I'm a dentist by profession. I'm used to getting things done. Somebody comes in my office having a dental problem, we diagnose it. We sell that to the patient. I say sell. We convince the patient that treatment is necessary, and we get the thing done, and they leave usually smiling and happy. Up here, it doesn't seem to work like that. I wish it did, but it doesn't. One day last week, we had 12,000 illegals come across the border. Most of them over in Arizona, and thanks to the great state of Texas and our governor, I have been trying to convince him for a long time to declare an invasion, and I was very, very happy that he did, because 7 of my 9 counties that I represent, county resolutions, said, this is an invasion, Congressman. We are being overwhelmed. And guess what? We are nearly 300 miles from the border in my district. My district is the Houston area to Louisiana. And we simply have got to secure this border. If we don't, I don't see this country lasting as we know it. That's just the simple fact of the matter. We should not be negotiating border security. We should be enacting it. And quite frankly, I can't sit up here and explain and speak on behalf of some of my Republican colleagues that won't vote for border security. It's either they're foolishly compassionate, or about they've been convinced by the Democrats that this is the right thing to do, or it could be an ideological thing as well, or it could be an economic thing. I think we all know that there's groups that you would think would be Republicans. U.S. Chamber's one of them. That it's an economic thing. They want cheap labor, and since the pandemic, we've got major unemployment by folks that just simply won't seek a job because they're cashing a check each month and don't need to work. And so it's totally economics when you look at it from that standpoint. But the Republican Party, let me tell you something. If we put a Republican back in the White House, he has got to have interior enforcement in a major way. We've already had 9 to 10 million cross. We cannot allow those people to stay in here. We have to have interior enforcement. We have another whole year to go. As we said, 12,000 crossed in one day. How many are going to come across by the end of this year? We cannot incentivize further illegal immigration. To leave these folks without interior enforcement in this country will be nothing but incentivization to keep coming. They know if they get in, they can stay, and eventually they will have, as the Democrats we've seen, their very first bill under Nancy Pelosi, H.R. 1, was a takeover of our election process by the federal government, and included in that was the ability for foreign nationals to vote. And we know what it is. I mean, everybody knows that this is what's going on there. And so we have to make sure that we start disincentivizing illegal immigration. And sad to say that Republicans do. We talk about border issues, but we can't seem to get on the same page. But I will say this, and I've already mentioned it, H.R. 2 is a tough, good bill that would put this country on the road to a secure border if only the Democrats would let that come to the floor in the Senate. This next year's election is going to make that determination.
Thank you, sir. Representative Hageman, thank you for coming. It's very nice to see you again. Your victory was extraordinarily important. The person that occupied that seat was persecuting the right. And the landslide in which you won was a marvelous moment for many that many celebrated. And therefore, in a way, it's an optimistic case for the future, as opposed to some of the very pessimistic observations that we've made here so far. Flesh it out. What would it mean? How should the right look optimistically on its future? What would it need to change about itself, confront about itself, to move forward in a successful way?
Well, thank you, Arthur. Thank you for having me here today. And thank you for having me here today. And I think one of the things that we have to recognize, and this builds a bit more on your last panel and some of the points that they made, we have to understand how we got to the current position of where we are if we're going to be able to fix it going forward. And one of the things that I think is critically important is understanding what happened about 85 years ago and then move forward on steroids starting under the Clinton administration. And that is the dramatic expansion in the administrative state. So what has happened is we turned over so much of our legislating, Congress, the congressional body, and this has happened at both the state and federal levels, we've turned over so much of our legislating responsibility to the unelected bureaucrats that the unelected bureaucrats are the ones that are dictating policy in this country. And we were talking just a moment ago about the concept of disparate impact. Well, disparate impact was created in the early 1970s by the EEOC as a mechanism by which they could control what was going on in the boardroom and private companies. The interesting thing about that is the EEOC, number one, has no rulemaking authority. The disparate impact requirements have never been put into rules because they can't be. And yet here we are 50 years later, where every time there is a disparate outcome in any kind of an action taken in a private company, you've got enforcement mechanisms that swoop in and attempt to tell these private companies what they can do. So when you want to find out why our corporations have become the mouthpieces of the left wing or the woke, what you have to understand is that administrative agencies and regulatories have an inordinate amount of power in this country, and they have wielded it in a way that they know they would never get the policies through if they actually had to vote on them. So when Congress and our state legislators abdicate their responsibility of not legislating, but instead write into their statutes themselves, it is up to the EEOC to determine how this statute will be carried out, or it is up to the Secretary of Interior to carry out the intent of this particular bill dealing with our Bureau of Land Management lands. Then you can understand that the left has been able to move things further and further and further and further to the left, despite the fact that we are a center-right country. So I think one of the things that's critically important and why I'm optimistic is that more people are understanding this and recognizing what the administrative regulatory regime does to us every day. So I'm very proud to serve on the Judiciary Committee with Dan and Jim Jordan, and I'm also on the Select Committee on the Weaponization of the Federal Government. And while we don't have the Senate and we don't have the White House right now, what I do believe we've been able to do pretty effectively is expose the nature of what is going on in this country. We had Jonathan Turley as one of our very first witnesses in the Select Committee on Weaponization, and we talked about a violation of our First Amendment rights through surrogacy. So it isn't that Joe Biden went out and said, you can't say that, or it isn't that that one of us went out and said that. What did they do? They went to Facebook, and they went to Twitter, and they went to all of these companies, and they said, we don't like what's being said here. We don't like these jokes. We don't like these statements. We don't like anybody pushing back on COVID. And so they got the companies to do their dirty work. And then they sat back and said, well, that wasn't us. We didn't do that. But that's illegal. And in Missouri versus Biden, we have two incredible decisions saying that. And I think the United States Supreme Court will affirm that outcome. We've had Matt Taibbi and Michael Schellenberger come and describe what they have been able to uncover and disclose. And I always say sunshine is the best disinfectant, and this place needs to be fumigated. And with those two gentlemen and others like them, we have been able to expose the level of censorship that all of us are living under. And all of us are now saying, nuh-uh, no more, no more, no more. We're not doing this anymore. So we're getting pushback from the people who need to be pushing back. So number one, I think that we need to understand that when Congress does not do its job of legislating, we're the only ones who can be held accountable. You brought up in introducing me, I beat Liz Cheney. I beat her because she did what we didn't want her to do, so we threw her out of office, right? That's called accountability. That's what voting does. That's the kind of country that we have. But who runs the EEOC? Who's the undersecretary of the undersecretary of the undersecretary who ensures that we enforce disparate impact rules and regulations? We don't know. They can never be held accountable. We've got to push that decision-making authority back to Congress where it belongs. You need to hold people like me accountable. We need to be exposing what the administrative state has ultimately done to us, and then we can fight back against it and expose it, because it is such an antithesis to the very foundation of our form of government, which is separation of power and individual rights. And if you look at the separation of powers, the very purpose of that paradigm was to make sure that our individual rights were protected, whether it was from the executive branch or the judicial or the legislative branch. That's our form of government, and we erase it when we allow unelected bureaucrats to make the decisions. So that's why I'm optimistic, because I think we're talking about things. I've been talking about this for 25 years, but I was a practicing attorney who had to fight it every day. But a lot of people don't know where it comes from. Now we have ways in which to fight back, and my friend Dan Bishop and I, right now, we're trying to find a way to push forward with a bill that would hold individual federal employees, if they violate someone's First Amendment right, they can be held personally accountable. We're trying to create the federal version of 42 USC Section 1983, because we believe that if these folks are actually held accountable for violating the Constitution, they're going to be a lot less inclined to violate the Constitution. I think that's a step in the right direction.
Thank you. Yes. Yeah, Mr. Bishop, maybe you can pick up from there. REINS Act, that has been proposed for many years. We'd like to know your opinion on that, and what would be the next step after that? There are tens of thousands of hostile bureaucrats that want to limit, stymie everything that we do, even if it so happens we recapture the White House.
Arthur, it's a great question. The REINS Act is a great idea, and it's been around as an intellectual notion for 15, 20 years. Right. And we proposed it as part of the Limit, Save, Grow package that we actually got 218 votes on before the debt ceiling negotiations this year. But the idea is and you can define it by different thresholds, but a regulation having major economic impact can't go forward unless it's approved by Congress, and that makes all the sense in the world. We have right now EPA proposing a rule on CAFE standards that would radically alter the marketplace for automobiles in the United States. Basically, and I forget the numbers, but it would require something like 2/3 of them to be EVs in practical effect. And let me tell you, among other things, automobile dealers know that people don't want them. They don't want to buy them, and so they know that's. REINS Act wouldn't permit that to happen, because what's happening is members of Congress are getting on letters to beseech the EPA not to go forward with a rule making law that Congress would never do, because the people would be thrown out of office for it, and yet the EPA is just going to roll on under a conception of their power that no one ever thought they had, to radically alter the ability of American people to use automobiles, one of the keys, frankly, to freedom. And so the Reins Act would be a great idea, but again, we put it in a piece of legislation, but we weren't prepared to fight for it. We weren't prepared to stand in the breach to see to it that it got done. That's why, and then slip into a parallel concept. Your last panel made reference to a corrupted civil rights regime. Well, the reason that we see action having been taken on, barring what Harriet and I are proposing, but action being taken on what the district court in Louisiana called the most massive attack on free speech in U.S. history in the Missouri versus Biden case, is because that was required state attorneys general to take action that Congress has not taken firm action to deal with. I had in a subcommittee hearing last week, the Assistant Attorney General for the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice was there, and my question was whether there's any criminal investigation or prosecution ongoing within the Justice Department on those, with respect to those persons who colluded to undertake what that district court described in a case that's been affirmed by the Fifth Circuit, is now on further appeal to the United States Supreme Court. And her answer was not whether or not there's an investigation or prosecution. She said, "I'm sorry, Congressman, I don't know what that litigation is." And I followed up because I was so dumbfounded. I said, "You do?" I said, "Again, this is what the district court said the case was about. It's in the United States Supreme Court now. You don't know what that is? I'm sorry, Congressman. Maybe if you could describe it more, I would." So that is is the First Amendment a civil right? So in other words, we have a very there's ideology governing what the Department of Justice is doing in civil rights. So it's become a weapon of ideological warfare by one segment of the country against another. What the Justice Department should be doing is to enforce our basic civil rights. Instead, the Justice Department has become the instrumentality of attacking them. As you say, well, I'll say first, Harriet and I have this bill. The Supreme Court has decided there's no Bivens action for those who know what that is, for a First Amendment claim. It's totally irremediable by someone who's been injured by that deprivation of rights, which has been at scale. So Congress won't take a step. Members of Congress can't be persuaded to stand in the breach and reduce the appropriations to the Justice Department or the FBI or otherwise reform that in the radical way that it obviously needs to be done. If there is a Republican administration, the question you have to ask yourself is whether there'll be an Attorney General confirmable by the Senate who will take the remedial actions necessary. And I mean, Hunter Biden's protection in the Department of Justice occurred across the Trump administration. I'm saying there's got to be there has to be a fairly radical reset of the mind to be able to take the actions necessary to move the needle. Otherwise, we're all standing there greatly upset about any number of phenomena, but completely impotent to do something about it. And that's why I think tools, not to hit it again, but I mean, the Missouri versus Biden's Attorney General litigation, as I say, I'm going to try to do that. That's not actually a healthy thing either, that we're looking to frankly, a transformed state office, the Attorney General offices, to litigate issues that ought to be able to be solved as a matter of policy through sensible exercise of Congress. And instead we have members of Congress sit here like eunuchs asking the please EPA, do not destroy the car market. And I just think something so I'm very drawn to the idea that there is that we must have. I think you take President Trump's history. Someone said at one point in time he's teaching the GOP how to fight, and I think what you're talking about in this conference is bringing the intellectual heft to the same general attitude. The idea. I mean, I'm not trying to liken it to President Trump. I'm simply saying, after you sit in Congress for 25 years and see no meaningful impact on the status quo, I don't see doing the same thing over again should lead anybody to expect a different result. There must be a change of mind. It must be that members of Congress who get elected serving the status quo or worsening it, even if they go out and talk in election time about what we want to do, should find that incompatible with remaining in Congress or with rising to leadership in Congress. Just my view.
But, sir, just to follow up very briefly on this, I mean, surely you make this case to some of your colleagues in private.
Right now, in another room in the Capitol, we're talking about what FISA reform bill will come to the floor tomorrow. And we're going to see, what's going to happen tomorrow is we're going to see a bill, a FISA reform bill, which is in the jurisdiction of the Judiciary Committee. They're going to put up two, one coming out of the Intel Committee, which is supposed to exercise oversight over Intel. It's going to come, they're going to handle their own bill in judiciary jurisdiction on the floor. It's never been done before, not ever. So you're going to get two bills on the floor, whichever one gets greater votes is going to go forward, but one of them comes out of the Judiciary Committee, which after all of the abuses under FISA Section 702, will expand the authority of the Intel state under that law. Their bill. Right, their bill. But the one that must proceed, that's the point. And I will say, I actually think one other thing, and this one's a little frightening perhaps, but I think that for us to begin to make progress, it's going to start first, this is going to sound inconsistent with what I've said, it's going to start first in that area where you can attract bipartisan support against orthodoxy or against conventional wisdom. And that may be one. If the judiciary FISA reform bill goes forward tomorrow, it's going to be because Democrats, frankly, farther left Democrats, have the same concerns with the Intel state that civil libertarians on the right have. So we'll see what happens. But you're absolutely right that it is ubiquitous in the matters that happen here. There's the meaningful reform that gets blunted every time by sort of a notion that, I don't know, whether it's hand-wringing. Republicans, conservatives, they're conservatives, frankly. They will speak at length. They will worry a great deal about all these phenomena that threaten the American people, but they will not meet the moment when it comes down to something that that requires shutting the government down for a period of time, or requires negotiating over the debt limit, something, or in the thing that we see coming forward perhaps soon, H.R. 2 in exchange for further aid to Ukraine. I've never voted for any aid to Ukraine, but what I think that actually sounds like it's devolving into is perhaps some gesture towards border security. If it's not H.R. 2, if it's not a fundamental change, it's not going to fix anything. And I think the American people, I can tell you this, I go around, I see voters a lot, Republican voters, and it's amazing how much farther they are ahead than Congress.
Yes.
And in fact, all the folks that we're working together with in Washington need to take a lesson from the people who are out there. I don't think it's pandering to say it. They have figured things, and they are so beside themselves with frustration that they see time after time, give us another chamber, give us the White House, we're going to fix it when we have the White House, and it never comes to pass. I will say this last thing. Unless there is a change, unless the kind of re-examination happens quickly and it produces real courage, will, talked about ferocity and ruthlessness. I don't know if I'd use those terms, vehemence, certainly. If that doesn't happen, whole swaths of what otherwise is going to, it would be the following to general conservatism in general will fall away, because it's wholly useless to continue to pursue it if it can be talked about and cosmetically presented, but never actually pursued when the chips are down. Right.
Thank you. Mr. Babbitt, you know that Australia some years ago had birthright citizenship, and then they got rid of it. And you also know that President Trump for a long time discussed putting forth an executive order to change our current understanding of birthright citizenship, and that also was brushed under the rug, was forgotten about. It's not entirely clear. But you have been thinking about this and presented a bill on it. Could you
right.
tell us a little bit about it and why this is so important?
Well, it's extremely important. I mean, again, the border and immigration are destroying our great republic. That's what's happening. And so much so that even though I'm on transportation and infrastructure and space science and technology, I serve as one of the co-chairs on the House Border Security Caucus and also serve on the task force on Mexican drug cartels. But I feel so strongly about the birthright citizenship that, as you said, I have introduced to the Birthright Citizenship Act of 2023. And for a period, comes out of the 14th Amendment, for a period following the enactment of the 14th Amendment, Section 1, it was properly applied as written and as intended to ensure that all American citizens were afforded the sacred constitutional protections that they deserve. And this was after the Civil War. And while these are important protections, they remain in recent decades, this 14th Amendment has been misapplied and misinterpreted. The specific language in the amendment has led to the implementation of the practice of birthright citizenship by which children born to foreign nationals, from illegal immigrants to tourists to refugees, are automatically granted United States citizenship. It has created birth tourism. There's an entire industry on this right now. Unsurprisingly, birthright citizenship is a very, very powerful incentive for illegal immigration, and over time it has been wrongly accepted as the law, with supporters claiming that our Constitution guarantees it. It does not. I am a dentist. I am not an attorney. But read that 14th Amendment. You don't have to be an attorney to see that this thing has been totally misapplied and misinterpreted. I think this issue has to be brought to the Supreme Court. We cannot guarantee success there. I think right now, with the current membership of the court, I think we have a good shot at having this thing reinterpreted in a way that would do some real good. But we will never have the opportunity unless we stand up and fight for birthright citizenship to be reinterpreted in a way that makes sense. Our immigration system is supposed to benefit the United States of America. It is not there to benefit foreign nationals who want to come into the United States. And as you've heard both of these other individuals tonight say, it's going to take courage. We've got to stand up because no one likes to be called xenophobe, homophobe, Islamophobe, all kinds of phobes. Dentist phobe. I dealt with that for 38 years. But birthright citizenship is enabled by this faulty legal application, ending the practice by clarifying the eligibility of birthright citizenship is a necessary step in fixing this broken immigration system that we have and stopping the complete exploitation of the generosity of the United States of America.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
We have just a few minutes remaining. And Mrs. Hageman, I want to talk a little bit about what you see from your constituents. I mean, as I said before, they resoundingly voted for something different. These frustrations have been going on for so long throughout the country, especially visible in your district, but throughout the country. What do you see? I mean, this cannot build forever. You know, it either goes in one direction or in another. What do you see?
So I didn't intend to run for Congress, but when I watched our representative fail us on so many different levels and fail to listen to the citizens of Wyoming, I realized that it was time to step up and actually become engaged on a completely different level than I had been as a private attorney. So I have often said I was not running against Liz Cheney, but I was running for Wyoming. And I think it's important for every representative to feel that way. We aren't running against things, we are running for something. And there are so many things in the United States, and especially right now, to take that position on. So while I was running, I had the opportunity to give a speech, and it was called the We're Fed Up speech. And I don't know how many of you may have seen the video. It was, I didn't expect it to become the story that it has, or to be seen as much as it has. But all I did was describe a litany, or set forth a litany of the things that we are fed up with. And that is where the Wyoming people are, and it's where the American public is. And that's why I will agree with Dan, and I will agree with Brian both, that the American public and conservatives and Republicans and parents and business owners are further ahead than we are in terms of recognizing where we're going if we don't change course. And this isn't something about changing course in 2027 or 2032. It is about changing course right now, because we don't have a lot of runway left. We are fed up with a government that doesn't seem to work for the American public anymore, but seems to work very well for the elitists in Washington, D.C. We are fed up with a Department of Education that believes that boys should be able to participate in girls' sports and that girls should simply put up with that. We are fed up with the Nancy Pelosi's of the world. We're fed up with the Hunter Bidens of the world. We're fed up with the way that our government is no longer working for us, but working for some of the people in Washington, D.C., and New York City and Los Angeles, and allowing them to amalgamate and stockpile more and more power for them and their friends, while the rest of us are left further behind. I come from one of the largest energy producing states in the nation, and I'm extremely proud of that. We make everybody's lives better. We're the largest coal producers in the nation. We produced 250 million tons last year, and I hope it's double that next year. We produce oil and gas. We have the ability to produce uranium. We are one of the top cattle producers in the nation. Everything that we do increases our prosperity. And the fact is that our Constitution gave us the foundation of freedom and liberty, but it is affordable energy, housing, and food that has given us the prosperity that we have enjoyed in this country that is unrivaled in human history. We have a certain segment of the population right now that wants to take that away, and they're using everything from the UN to the COP28 to John Kerry and all of these other things to try to destroy our prosperity, to do exactly what Brian has said, which is to implement a Marxist state of play that none of us want, and that the people who are attempting to impose it will never have to live under. So what do the Wyoming people say right now? They say we're fed up. We're fed up with the nonsense that comes out of this place where we can't fix problems, which are really not insurmountable. I'm the chairman of the subcommittee on Indian and Insular Affairs. I could list off 15 things right now that are bipartisan and bicameral that we could fix if we simply got the words down on paper, moved back and forth across that little place out there, that little concrete island out there, about 6 times. We'd have it done and we'd solve problems. We have the ability to solve problems. We don't, because there is a disincentive to solve problems. There is an incentive to continue to have them in play, and there is also there is an incentive to disenfranchise the American public. But again, why I'm optimistic is I'm not alone in saying these things. I'm not just screaming in the dark. There are a lot of leaders out there at the local, state, and national level. Many of my freshmen that I came into this class with feel exactly the same way that I do. Status quo is no longer acceptable. The status quo is no longer going to be tolerable, because the American people have moved beyond just saying, we'll fix it next time. We can't just fix it next time. Next time is now. Next time is right now. We've got to fix these things. They aren't insurmountable. We have a document that tells us how to do it. We should have a judiciary who would help us to do it. And we need to have a legislative branch who's willing to push forward with what are common sense solutions to some difficult issues. And some of them are going to be harder than others. But doggone it, we got to try.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And please thank our panelists.
Go vote.
Finally, I want to welcome to the podium the person whose brainchild this conference really is. Our friend, the former Republican Study Committee chair, the founder of the Anti-Woke Caucus, and the future senator from Indiana, Jim Banks.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all of you for being here today. How about that panel? I thought they were terrific. We've had a great crowd. We've had a great discussion. I just want to share a few closing thoughts with all of you. Something that we all have in common, I think, who have come here to be a part of this today, is that we all agree that America is in a war to preserve this country as the greatest country in the history of the world. And that's my big takeaway from conservatism and today's panel, and why I think it's so important that so many more of my colleagues digest this book, so many more of you go out and share the contents of this book, because that's also the difference between, I believe, between the old GOP and the new GOP. And you just got a flavor of that from three of my colleagues who I respect so greatly, and it's why we hand-selected them to come and speak to all of you today, because they understand that we are in a war, that this is a battle to save the country, and they operate in that way each and every day in their service on Capitol Hill. The woke left has declared war on America. They are trying to destroy our country so that they can rebuild it from the ground up according to their rules, not according to the Constitution, Congress, or the law. And I think all of us understand, especially after this discussion, if you've read the contents of the book, you understand this even more. This isn't a partial war. This is a total war. The left isn't demanding unconditional surrender. So we have to stop calling for truces. And we have to stop backing down to the left in the way that the old GOP would do every single time that they had even a little bit of power to fight back. The other side isn't interested in honest negotiating. So really, who cares about arguing over tax credits when they want illegal immigrants to be able to vote? The left believes in chemically castrating children, and they want parents who disagree with them to lose custody of their kids. So I've been to a war. I served in a war in Afghanistan. And you know, when you've been to a war, you know that when you're in a war, you've got to see through the fog of war. I think this is really important. I think what From Conservatism does more than anything, it helps us see through the fog of war. So we need to assess the situation that we're in truthfully. So let's be honest about a few things. You just heard from three of my esteemed colleagues. I mean, one of them did a great service to America when she defeated Liz Cheney in the election last year. We just talked about it. She did it by the largest margin of victory that any challenger has ever beat an incumbent member of Congress. Harriet Hageman beat Liz Cheney by that margin and even a whole lot more. You heard from Dan Bishop, who I believe is has one of the strongest backbones of anyone who serves in Congress. The guy never backs down. And you heard from Dr. Brian Babin, who I believe is the most decent man to walk the halls of the Congress. And all three of them, you got a flavor of this already. All three of them know that we've been in the majority for 1 year, and we don't have a whole lot to show for it. And I think this is, Harriet, I think this is shameful. We've had the majority for a year. We don't have a whole lot to show for it. So let's be honest about it. What have we accomplished over the last year? I suppose one thing we accomplished is we turned a 5-seat majority into a 2-seat majority. No one's ever done that before. We've really fallen flat on our face and holding Mayorkas and Biden accountable. We sure got that Santos guy, right? Maybe those are the two accomplishments of this Congress. Now, I'm really enjoying the cameo videos. So if that's what it took to get the fun cameo videos, maybe that was worth it. I don't know. But a 5-seat majority and a 2-seat majority, and literally nothing legislative-wise after 1 year in the majority that this Republican majority can show to the American people that we've done with it, that we've done with what they gave us when they gave us the power of the gavels and the majority. But on the flip side, and I think this is really important, what a lot of people think of and look at when they look at the House and the Republican majority, what a lot of people call chaos, I think is progress. Okay, why do I say that? Because my grandpa always said two things. He said, why is it that the Democrats all go do what Nancy Pelosi tells them to do, and Republicans just kind of, flap in the wind and fight with themselves? In this case, I think that chaos and those internal fights are a sign of the new GOP winning. I mean, I really do. I think that the fights that we've had in the House, this Congress, with the new Republicans like Harriet and other new Republicans in the House show some progress. Now, another thing that I point to when I think of progress is the very first speaker that we heard from today. JD Vance, I believe, is the very best of what we've got going for us in the new GOP and the United States Senate. Okay, he's the smartest man in the Senate, and he represents the new flavor of the GOP that we're all looking for. And one thing that JD is doing, he didn't talk about it today, but he's blocking every single Biden Department of Justice nominee. I think one of our Claremont panelists talked about this, not going along with nominees who don't stand for America and don't put America first and voting against them. You got Senator Tuberville, who's holding up Pentagon nominees. I know he gave up on a lot of the holds last week, but there are still 11 very woke generals who are being blocked for promotion by Senator Tuberville and Senator Eric Schmidt from Missouri, who's joined into that crusade to stop woke generals from being elevated even further at the Pentagon. Now, what do all three of those United States senators have in common? They're all freshman, first-year United States Republican senators. And for me, that gives me hope that the new right is moving the party in the right direction. You even have Mitch McConnell and Mitt Romney now saying no more blank checks for Ukraine. How about that? That's progress, right? I can't name 3 provinces in Ukraine either. But I'm not voting for money to go to Ukraine and bankrupting my country while our southern border remains wide open. So earlier this year, in closing, we started the first ever anti-woke caucus in Congress. I thought it was clever at the time. We gathered dozens of my Republican colleagues who feel like I do that wokeism is a cancer that is eating America inside out and will do so if we don't do something to stop it. Harriet Hageman is a leader in the anti-woke caucus. Congressman Bishop and Congressman Babin attend every single one of our anti-woke caucus meetings. What we've done is we've come together to strategize. We don't just get together and talk about it. We strategize, and then we write amendments and advance those amendments in a lot of the bills that move their way through the House. And we've passed amendments out of the House that aren't going anywhere in the Senate, but to reinstate COVID vaccine discharges from the military. We've passed amendments to ban drag shows on Department of Defense bases, ending racial discrimination at military academies, slashing DEI bureaucrats' pay. It's one of the few things that actually did survive in the NDAA that's going to pass out of both the House and the Senate is an amendment that the anti-woke caucus led to cap DEI bureaucrats' pay at a very low amount at the Pentagon. We prohibit the Department of Defense from paying disinformation firms like NewsGuard to censor Americans. That's an amendment that actually did pass all the way through. So we've had some big wins out of the House and some smaller wins that will pass all the way out of the Congress because of our strategizing and coming together to work as an anti-woke caucus. Representative Babin, by the way, passed an amendment to zero out Secretary Mayorkas' salary, like that passed out of the House to completely zero out his pay. Representative Hageman passed an amendment to defund DHS's environmental justice and climate literacy strategy. Okay, I mean, it's crazy to say that out loud, but Harriet Hageman passed an amendment out of the entire House of Representatives to do that. Senator Vance and I just introduced legislation to pull federal student aid assistance from colleges that failed to comply with the Supreme Court's affirmative action ban. That's a bill that we've collectively worked on in the House and the Senate that is a product of the anti-woke caucus. So the big point here, to summarize everything that we've talked about, is this: Republicans are starting to fight back like we haven't fought back before. We're doing it in an organized way, and we're going to keep doing it over the next year so that after 2024, we have a chance to end and win this war for America once and for all. So let me because he didn't do it, and I think it's really important. Let me wrap this up, Arthur, by reading an excerpt from, I think, the most brilliant thing that you've ever written. I say that with a lot of humility, as someone who's read a lot of the important work that you and Claremont Institute has done. In its opening pages of Up From Conservatism, Arthur Millick writes this: "The time calls for another renewal with new goals, different strategies, and a disposition that fits a changing America. A marked change in the new right is one in attitude, a growing boldness that restores something near to real politics. Overt contention concerning core questions of the common good. The new right recognizes the left as an enemy, not merely an opposing movement, because the left today promotes a tyrannical conception of justice that is irreconcilable with the American idea of justice. The establishment right hoped to be left alone. The new right understands that that is impossible. The left is imperious, morally and politically. The left cannot rest until all minds, institutions, traditions, and laws are assimilated to its project. It has shown its willingness to tear through all of America's accumulated social capital, to tear down all institutions, including churches and families, to humiliate, corner, and dissolve all opposition. It has not hesitated to deploy violent mobs against cities, suburbs, and individual residences, to subvert the rule of law, and to employ eliminationist rhetoric against America, its monuments, its symbols, its people that it hates. The left's relentless and intensifying assault on America has made many citizens question whether the nation can endure. Millions have tried to move to safety out of blue cities and states or into suburbs and rural areas. Others still hope that they will be left alone. But the new right sees that hiding in the woods is not a viable political strategy. Only a few clever dissidents may be able to swim alongside the shark like suckerfish. And even this will work for only a limited time. There must be a political force that earnestly opposes this tyranny and wields legitimate political power in a way the old right was allergic to. That is the goal of the new right. And with that, thank you for participating today. Please digest this and share it, share the contents of it. Have a good day.